Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to ISCEA Student Chapter Egypt seminar on extruring and the replacing of global supply chains. I am Omar Hagras, the president of the Student Chapter Egypt and your host for today's seminar. With our expert for today, Prof. Collins, who will help us understand this topic in more details. First of all, sorry for any disruption due to internet error, and let's begin our seminar.
Inviting me, and I appreciate ISCEA for having the opportunity to share with you. And first, I'd really like to congratulate you on studying supply chain management. You couldn't be in a better time to be in the supply chain, as there's so much adaptation, so much change happening in the global supply chain. And that's something that I wanted to share with you a little bit today on some of the work that I do on what I call X-shoring. Again, welcome you, and talk a little bit about what we're going to do in X-shoring. First, a bit of introduction about myself. I am a professor in supply chain management at Arizona State University.
The presentation I didn't see it.
Can you see that? The presentation?
Till now.
Okay, let me get this up here for you. How about now?
Yeah. Yeah.
You're able to see that?
Starting. Now.
Are you able, Omar, you're able to see that now? And participants? Let me just go back here to you. Sorry about that. Omar, are you able to see the presentation? You're able to see the presentation, Omar?
It's coding, so
Okay.
and it's to
And let me introduce a little bit about myself. I'm a professor of supply chain management at Arizona State University, Department of Supply Chain Management. And I always wasn't a professor for my whole career. I've only been a professor now for 6 years. Most of my professional
I
career.
think yeah.
Most of my professional career was in China. When I graduated with my MBA in supply chain management, I went to work for Microsoft. And during the very first Xbox development.
Yeah. It's appearing.
And developing that first Xbox supply chain I was working at Microsoft to build a China-based supply chain.
Yeah. It's appearing. Okay.
And then there, Microsoft as a software company didn't have its own factories and didn't have its own hardware supply chain. So we used a company that was that specialized in manufacturing electronics for brand customers like a Microsoft, or for mobile phones, or for HP printers, or telecommunications electronics. And that company was Flextronics. So I started up that Flextronics operation in Shanghai, Tianjin, Nanjing, Changzhou, and then the Shanghai Industrial Park I built in Shanghai over those few years. And that was really critical years in the supply chain, because the low cost labor in China and the size of China and the demographics of China were able to handle doing very, very large scale manufacturing. Up to that point, you didn't really have global brands that could build such very high volumes to sell globally across the world. And then I ran the Asia Pacific at Flextronics, and then I started my own company, the Lakeline Group, and we started to work with companies around the world, quite a few in Europe, quite a few in Asia, quite a few Latin America, that wanted to build low-cost supply chains and start building that global supply chain. And so today we're going to talk about X-shoring. And I termed this X-shoring because there are, for 30 years, outsourcing was so prevalent in the global supply chain, and that was constantly looking for the lowest cost labor to assemble hardware type of products in just about anything, from automotive cables to electronic devices, consumer devices, all of the mobile phones that we use today, shoes and apparel. So we use all these terms of when we outsourced it. And with X-shoring is a collective term for all of these of offshoring, outsourcing, onshoring, reshoring, nearshoring, because there's so much change happening in the global supply chain today that is relatively new for all of us globally. All of us remember the COVID-19 pandemic, the desire for how do we make supply chains resilient, how do we get end-to-end visibility of our second and third tier suppliers, how do we use data and artificial intelligence and have an ability to see our supply chain and anticipate risks, or to respond to risks and be resilient. And I don't think I need to even mention, as you were in Egypt, you were seeing turbulence in the supply chain in the Red Sea through your Suez Canal, and that is changing a lot of traffic flows. And so supply chain and X-shoring is a response to increasing uncertainty within the supply chain. So X-shoring itself is an initiative to create and realign or rebalance the global supply chains. And what's interesting is, if you look over the last 35 years, that the world trade globally in US dollars really started to go almost exponential in the early 1990s. And what happened in the early 1990s? And at that time, the Cold War had ended. New technologies of computing became more prevalent, and new management ideas about how to get the highest scale and develop global branding. So if you think about computing, for instance, think about Dell, or you think about HP. Many of these kind of technologies, you wouldn't be able to build for a massive scale and a massive sales around the world in a country. Take Egypt, 110 million people, or the United States, 330 million people. We could build products, but you need to have a lot of people, especially with a lot of the labor-paced processes that we have. And so what happened during that time in that early 1990s was a large push as China started to finally open up after many years of war and strife and others, and very friendly for business. But China has 1.4 billion people. So by being able to have low cost labor and also build it in tremendous scale. And when we say tremendous scale, think about factories with 20,000 people in them, or the Foxconn factory. Foxconn is the manufacturer of the Apple iPhone. They had a campus with 250,000 people manufacturing products in electronics. That's just not possible in most countries in the world, given the population, and being able to recruit very quickly and be able to train and to build up that kind of scale and the kind of infrastructure for logistics, for the shipping infrastructure, the port capacity, the ability to produce, ship all over the world was not possible until then. But it took off, and most of the high volume products that you see in the world, many of those being manufactured in China because of the low cost labor and the and getting high economies of scale in terms of purchasing, in terms of sourcing, and being able to drive very, very high efficiencies with technologies and processes like lean manufacturing. So a lot of things have happened in recent years, not to mention, we mentioned already COVID-19 pandemic, which affected us all around the world. But there's a whole lot of geopolitical change going on in the world, whereas China was a very open economy in the late 90s late 90s, and was attracting businesses to move to China and build very high volumes of type products. A lot of things have changed. And we did some in our research, we did some questions about reevaluating the trade-offs that lead to X-shoring. Well, there's a lot of incentive now for many companies to diversify their supply chains. One of the largest trends is to, if you have a whole supply chain in China, how can I diversify that supply chain? Because you might have the earthquake in 2011 in Japan, you have floods, and all of your manufacturing, your whole supply chain in only one geography of the world creates a lot of risk for companies. And so that economies of scale and that lowest cost per unit that economies of scale drive, how do we diversify supply chains? Can we create from one supply chain in China? Can we move to 3 or 4 regional different supply chains, like have one in Europe, have one in Africa, have one in North America or in Central or South America that serves? And also with the questions there, the labor rates in China have gone up considerably since the late 90s when it was very inexpensive. Now there's many countries that have lower cost labor. So that helps as we build models, and you as supply chain management students will build cost models. We'll build what is a cost model and how do I build that into my risk assessment to make decisions about how we operate and how we design our supply chains. So there are many reasons of why X-shoring now has become a significant trend in the supply chain. It's geopolitical risk, it's assurance of supply, it's reduction of lead times. All of these are significant sources of reasons for why supply chains globally are transforming. So if you think about China, and the world is a lot bigger than just China, but as a lot of the commodity type of items, consumer electronics, when computers were starting and mobile phones were starting up, China was by far the most desirable location. And it wasn't just manufacturing and assembling the product, but it was building ecosystems around the supply chain and around these products. And in China, there are two significant supply chain ecosystems: the Yangtze River Delta, which is up centered around Shanghai, which has the largest port capacity in the world, and then the Pearl River Delta, which is down south in Guangdong, right across the bay from Hong Kong, which is an international global commerce center in Asia. And the supply chains built up so you could build industries and have all your second and third tier supply base built into these massive ecosystems. And the ecosystems are very large. The Made in China, I have this 2021 data of $17 trillion was the GDP of China in 2021, and it's still around that number now, given COVID, given some of the challenges that China is going through now after post-COVID. But those Yangtze River Delta and the Pearl River Delta are significant ecosystems that if you want to move or diversify manufacturing from China, how can you pick up a whole supply chain of 1,500 components and manufacture those very easily elsewhere? How can you move that somewhat elsewhere? So X-shoring is really only in its infancy about how our supply chains will look globally going forward. And product type matters. If you think about, okay, China is one country, it's 1.4 billion people, how much product and what kinds of products? So China is not a place where you build custom high value products. It was designed to create economies of scale in purchasing, that low labor cost for commodity type items. So on this chart, I have a forecast uncertainty on the vertical axis, and and it shows the kinds of products from when we sell commodities. We largely build them for many years. They have long life cycles. We know relative demand from historical forecasting that we do. These are optimal for high economies of scale manufacturing that is in China, which is very far from Egypt, very far from the United States, very far from Europe, and that's where most of the demand, if you think about where that demand comes from, having high forecast uncertainty creates a big problem. So if we're building high value custom installations or nuclear power plants, these are not the kinds of products that would be manufactured in China. It is the shoes and the apparel and the rubber gaskets. It's the pens and pencils, everything from hand tools to coffee makers that can be built in very high volumes and then can be shipped around the world at a low cost to consumers in those countries. So that product type is really what we're talking about when we talk about X-shoring. And I don't need to tell you, you know better than I, Egypt's critical role in the global supply chain. And all of these changes in X-shoring also impact Egypt and Africa. When you think about Egypt, the second largest economy in Africa, and the importance of the Suez Canal, particularly with the Red Sea crisis that has happened recently, which changes everything about our traffic flows even. So it's not about just only where something is manufactured, but it is also about how we transport and the cost of transportation, energy costs, and lead times that filter into the final supply chains, all of this has a reverberating impact on supply chains. So any delays early on in the supply chain for oil producers in the Middle East, and that going around, think about Siemens in Germany, who is building large installations, or they're building equipment. All of that energy filters in, not to mention how that delay, how that affects energy companies in Europe, where through that normally would go through that Suez Canal. And that Suez Canal is so important in the global trade. $1 trillion of product goes through that Suez Canal annually. 30% of the global container traffic goes through there, and 12% of the global trade. So the importance of, when you as supply chain management students think about your participation in the global supply chain, you are right in the center of a very important part of the supply chain, whether it's logistics, whether it's purchasing, whether it's contracts, whether it's demand planning, whether it's supply planning. So much of that is directly into your context within Egypt. So let's talk a little bit about what is that X-shoring and some of the strategies that are the trends in the supply chain globally today. First is the onshoring and reshoring. And in the context of the United States companies were largely, especially in high tech, were largely the companies that had begun to outsource that manufacturing to China 30 years ago. And that's where apparel and all of computers, when they were designed in the early 80s, personal computers really only started to be in everyone's home in the early 1990s. And this is when computing was just developing and semiconductors were just developing. And much of that was, let's go and assemble that in a low-cost location and in very large facilities, hand assembled, and start building a supply chain. And again, that was my first supply chain role in Microsoft, of outsourcing the Xbox and building the Xbox supply chain in China. So there's the onshoring and reshoring is, now that we face global challenges, global risks, change in the geopolitical risk environment, there's a lot of thought of, can we bring it back? Onshoring, do we bring manufacturing back, or can we nearshore that manufacturing to, say, Mexico, which is just south of the United States? And Mexico, Canada, and the United States, the three countries, have a agreement, a tariff-free importing of materials. So much, when you think of that, is moving some of the volume of supply chain from China to, say, Mexico, that has lower cost labor today than China, and can import and directly free into the United States. So if you think about an automotive company, a company like Ford that builds F-150 trucks, they build that product in Mexico, and then it ships tariff-free into the United States. And the bringing it from China now has much higher tariffs, as well as higher labor rates. So this onshoring and this reshoring is a significant trend. But there's an issue with that, and that is Mexico, not unlike, very similar to Egypt, Mexico has a 125 million person population, not 1.4 billion population. The demographics are good in having youthful population that can go and work in factories, can economically develop their communities for this, but it's not at a scale that China was able to do. So you move some of that manufacturing, as many companies are doing today, move some of that manufacturing to Mexico, but you can't leave that China market because there's no way to absorb the sheer volume. And I'll give you an example a little bit later of what I'm talking about. And when you think about the companies saying, okay, if I do regional manufacturing, which is kind of an onshoring or reshoring for the European companies, going to Eastern Europe, for instance. But again, those populations and the demographics of youthful people that are going to work in factories and to economically develop their communities is they're much smaller economies to absorb the sheer volume of the $17 trillion GDP of China. You know, cost is going to continue to matter. Resilience and security are what are driving a lot of the supply chain. Particularly, we were shocked during COVID in the United States. There were shortages of toilet paper. There was shortages of very basic types of commodities. There were automotive parts. There were massive shortages of supply that the country hadn't seen for many years. And this resilience, how do we come back from this resilience, or from a disruption in the supply chain? How do we build that back? Well, having more sources of supply is one way. Having different countries of manufacturing that product versus just having manufacturing only in one country that has disruption. So we're starting to see this regionalism of the supply chain globally, and we'll see how far this can go. But the volumes of commodity items coming from China, have challenges in going to many of the other kinds of companies or countries. And cost still does matter. There is no supply chain executive who wants to go to their board of directors, to their CEO, their CFO, and say, for resiliency and security, we're going to move some of the manufacturing, and it's only going to raise our cost a certain amount, 20%. Well, no one's willing to tolerate a 20%. So it is a conundrum in the supply chain, and you'll see that global companies and supply chains are trying to figure this out today. And many of you might even be participating in this when you graduate in your supply chain management studies. And the nearshoring I had mentioned already, with the nearshoring in the U.S. of nearshoring to Mexico, still the challenges of trying to get to the volume and being able to recruit talent. The shortage of talent, we did another study of some of the significant risks that companies face operationally or geopolitically, and globally, companies have very high on that list is a shortage of key talent. And you are the key talent in Egypt participating in the supply chain. There is not enough talent like you that understand analytics, that understand cost models, understand transportation, or understand purchasing and contracts globally, and how to do risk mitigation within the supply chain. So you are critical talent in the world for the nearshoring, the reshoring of product. And another significant trend in the X-shoring strategies is what we call China plus one. And I also have there China plus two, plus three for reasons mentioned. And one specific country that has had the advantage of some of the China plus one, the diversifying from the China supply chain for the very large volume of goods, has been Vietnam. And Vietnam is just south of China, but it has a land border with China. And Vietnam also is on the South China Sea and has a very significantly positive location in the world for shipping of product, and not necessarily the port capacity. So in building and by X-shoring, nearshoring, reshoring, most of those components for many years will still come from those ecosystems in China. But in Vietnam's case, they can come overland from the suppliers in the Pearl River Delta ecosystem or the Yangtze River Delta ecosystem to build a lot of product. And that has been a boom in in Vietnam because of its geolocation on the South China Sea, and also with a land connection with the supply chain that is China. And that's caused tremendous amount of economic development in Vietnam, in China, in Asia, also Malaysia, which has very significant long-term industrial manufacturing and supply chain experience, and talent of engineering, supply chain talent, also logistics capacity, and transportation networks that are also very valuable in that global supply chain. But Vietnam has had an oversized share of, because it was easy to move. It was also culturally close to China. So if you have a manufacturing process or you have a supply chain process, being able to pick that up and move that to another culture has a lot of challenges, because you need to have a culturally similar environment for that is suitable for that manufacturing or that supply chain process. Vietnam was culturally very similar for a lot of the manual assembly, the worker paced processes for many of these products in China, like mobile phones or like apparel. Samsung moved, the Korean company Samsung was doing most of its mobile phone assembly in China, in Tianjin, and then had moved a significant portion of that into Vietnam, and is one of the largest foreign investors in Vietnam. And they also have their Korean supply chain, which is fairly close for components going into Vietnam. Nike, 1/3 of Nike shoes, if any of you have athletic shoes from Nike, 1/3 of their manufacturing is in Vietnam. Another third is in Indonesia, and another third is in China. So you can see the diversification of the supply chain, instead of just having one location with low-cost labor that you can drive high economies of scale for the lowest cost per unit. You might have heard, and some of you, I wonder, might have iPhones, Apple iPhones. An Apple iPhone, the volume of an Apple iPhone today is roughly 250 million. Is before the globalization and the high economies of scale and move to China for low-cost manufacturing, there were very, very few consumer brands in the world that could drive such very high volume to ship all over the world. They, with iPhones that ship to almost every country of the world probably, and at 250 million, it's a highly significant volume of product. Apple never would have been the company it is today if it didn't have that global footprint in its very, very high volume manufacturing center in China. So recently, and as part of XShoring, Apple has decided with their manufacturing partner Foxconn, well, maybe we can move some of that manufacturing to India, which is also 1.4 billion people and their second largest market after China and the U.S. So that it's a very high volume market, and it's close to the source of demand, the proximity of demand, and also low cost labor and ability to build high volume of phones. But is India ready for prime time? It is a very different place culturally than China. To build a process in China and also have the trade laws, have the trade agreements between different countries, have the duty structures for importing of components, and then have exporting capacity, logistics capacity, and having logistics infrastructure that can handle that kind of high volume. India has always had the natural advantage with large population, a very young demographic population, and also English language as being one of its languages, it was a natural advantage for outsourcing and building manufacturing and building supply chains in that ecosystem, but it's been very challenging and hasn't been successful for through these 30 years where China has had the advantage of building out the logistics infrastructure, low-cost labor, and a completely different culture where when I was running factories, I could get 20,000 workers fairly quickly to come and train them up quickly and then start training them and building a product. India is culturally very different. You have multiple languages, you've got very different cultures, you've got different kinds of tax and local regional taxes that are very hard to navigate for most companies in India. So they will begin what we call the top level or the final assembly of the iPhone 15, I believe they're building there. But that supply chain will be years coming from China because it is so well established with those suppliers, the processes, the capital investment required in China. It's not easy when we talk about X-shoring to duplicate high capital investment for the supply chain in a place in another country at all. Hence, one of the challenges of X-shoring is you have to duplicate all of the students like you, all of the future supply chain professionals in 3 different geographies, your engineering talent, and the capital investment for machines, for spare parts, for your second and third tier supply chain. You need suppliers that can supply you quickly in all of those different geographies, and that's a massive challenge. But this is the trend in the supply chain, the global supply chain today, and much of that will continue to shift. Is it a permanent trend? We don't really know. Our supply chains were very stable globally for many decades, for 3-4 decades. It was a very stable supply chain and high volume manufacturing, low cost to consumers. But now, as we start to diversify the supply chains in different locations, how will that end up playing out? Do we have enough of talent that you can hire in a geography where you want to build a product? Can you hire the engineering? Can you hire that awesome Egyptian supply chain management talent in those locations? So that's where that really is without X-shoring. It's a significant and important trend happening in the world right now. And this is probably just not the end of the story, could even be the beginning of the story. So are you ready for X-shoring? Many of you will be involved with that in your lives. You will see much of this as you are going to be the leaders of the future supply chain, creating new supply chains, creating new analytics, bringing in that machine learning and artificial intelligence, which has a significant impact also on the supply chain. And again, that's just also at the beginning. So thank you so much. I really appreciate being able to spend this time with you and be able to share with you a significant trend in the supply chain. Thank you. Now, I'd like to ask for those of you that are on, do you have any questions, any exploration, or maybe tell me a little bit about yourselves and what you're hoping to do in the supply chain? Omar, how are we doing for time?
Yes.
Can everybody hear me okay? Can everybody hear me okay?
Professor Collins
There he is. Hey, Omar.
is very not about specific area. It's a whole. That's all for today. Thank you, Prof. Collins, to be with us today in our seminar. And sorry for what anything happened during the seminar due to internet error.